issue of trust, which was one of the biggest issues really in that debate last night when an audience member asked the question of why should we trust either leader. It got a very big laugh from the audience, and a debate like this is really not going to deepen the electorate's faith in either leader.
Thanks very much.
Well, we've got through to midday without a leader's speech. So far, that's about to change. Let's go live to Dundee. The SNP leader, Nicola Sturgeon, speaking there.
For Scotland, the question that debate posed is this: why should we be content for either of these men to run our country and shape our future? We can do so much better than that. And that underlines the importance of this election. It is now just a little over 3 weeks until people across Scotland and the UK will go to the polls. Now, all elections are important, of course they are, but this election really matters, because at stake is not just the next 5 years. The future of Scotland is on the line at this election. Now, I doubt there are many people in Scotland, perhaps there's not anyone in Scotland, who isn't heartily sick of Brexit and of the chaos we've seen played out at Westminster night after night. But we should be clear about this. If Brexit goes ahead, all that will turn out to have just been the warm-up act. Trade talks for the future haven't even started yet. And given the hardline approach of Boris Johnson, especially now with Nigel Farage pulling his strings, there is every chance that Scotland will be forced out of the EU next year with no trade deal at all. Leaving in that way will be an economic disaster. But any form of Brexit will hit jobs, it will hit living standards, and it will hit our public services. Boris Johnson, he wants a particularly hard Brexit, with Scotland outside not just the EU, but the single market and the customs union, the world's biggest trading bloc. His approach will subject us to years and years and years of wrangling over issues like trade, fisheries, data, security and migration. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn, as we saw last night, incredibly, still won't even tell us whether he wants the UK to leave the EU or to remain within it. The truth is, Westminster is going to be engulfed by Brexit chaos for years to come, with long-term damage to Scotland guaranteed. And that is why my message is clear. A vote for the SNP in this election is a vote to escape the mess of Brexit. And it is a vote to put Scotland's future where it belongs, in Scotland's hands, not leave it in the hands of Boris Johnson. And that really matters. Brexit hasn't come out of the blue. It is just an example, albeit an extreme example, of the high price Scotland pays for Westminster control. There is a democratic cost. The Tories haven't won a general election in Scotland for more than 60 years. But year after year, Scotland has been subjected to Tory governments we don't vote for. And that democratic cost comes with a severe practical cost to people's lives. Tory austerity over just the last 10 years has hit our public services hard. By the end of this decade, Westminster will have cut Scotland's budget by £1.5 billion in real terms. And let's not forget this. That's a cut inflicted not just by the Tories, but also in part by the Liberal Democrats when they were in coalition with the Tories. That's something voters in Scotland should not and will not forget. Now, by contrast, the SNP in government in Scotland, with very limited taxation powers, has prioritised investment in our NHS and other public services over tax cuts for the richest. We've introduced a fairer tax system and we've put record sums into our National Health Service. In government, the SNP has abolished prescription charges. We've protected free personal care for older people, and now we've extended it to people of all ages. And I think it's important to make this point. Free prescriptions and free personal care, these are not giveaways. These are an important part of the universal principle that underpins the NHS, the provision of care, free at the point of use, paid for collectively. It's an expression of our values and of our solidarity. And it's an example of the approach the SNP has taken in government, a Scottish model for public services. That means championing that universal principle, quality, publicly owned public services that benefit all of us, paid for through a progressive tax system. As part of that, we are investing in a massive expansion of early learning and childcare for vulnerable 2-year-olds and all 3- and 4-year-olds. This will be introduced in full next year, saving families up to £4,500 per child per year. And let me make this point. That saving is way more than any tax cut any party is offering working families, and it will deliver economic and social benefit. In our schools, we are working to drive up standards and close the poverty-related attainment gap with extra targeted investment through our Pupil Equity Fund. For students in our universities, we've abolished university tuition fees. Last week I heard a Tory turned Lib Dem, like so many of them. There are now, I believe, more Tories in the Lib Dems than there are Lib Dems. But I heard one of these Lib Dems say that free tuition was, and I quote, a fantasy. Perhaps you're not familiar with Scotland, but let me say very clearly, free tuition in Scotland is very much a reality, and it is a reality the SNP will always protect. And then take policing. Since 2007, when the SNP first took office, we have been investing while Westminster has been cutting. In England, police numbers have been cut by more than 20,000. The Tory pledge at this election doesn't even fully reverse that cut. By contrast, here in Scotland, the SNP has increased the number of police officers by more than 1,000. In fact, just to match us and restore England's share of police officers UK-wide, the Tories would need not the 20,000 extra officers they're promising, but 27,000. We've massively outstripped the rest of the UK in social and council house building as well. Over the most recent 4-year period that we have figures for, the SNP delivered 5 times more social rented properties per head of our population than in England. We've also kept water in public hands and made strategic interventions in important Scottish industries. Where the SNP Scottish Government is responsible for social security payments, our system is fairer, based on dignity, human rights and respect. And through it, we've already increased support for carers and for low-income families. Now, as we look to the future, we must keep investing. We must keep learning and reforming to benefit patients, our school pupils and communities across our country. And of course, as in any democracy, our government will come in for criticism and challenge. That is as it should be. And any government will face difficult tests. That is, of course, true for the SNP as it is for governments anywhere. But this Scottish model I have outlined, universal public services, paid for through progressive taxation, I believe has broad consensus support in Scotland. You know, one of the great advantages of countries of our size, as we see in other comparable nations, is a sense of cohesion, solidarity and shared goals. So although the Labour Party aggressively attacks the SNP, it is, I think, very striking just how much of their policy platform at this election borrows from what the SNP has already done in government. From free prescriptions to abolishing university tuition fees, to free personal care, to public ownership of the water industry and opposition to fracking, Labour has clearly been looking to Scotland for inspiration. And that might explain at least in part, why people in Scotland simply don't see the point in voting Labour anymore, because the SNP is already delivering what they are only promising. And the fact is, Labour can't win in Scotland. In all of the 13 seats the Conservatives hold here, it is the SNP who are the challengers. So if people in Scotland want to make sure that Boris Johnson does not get a majority, if they want to see a progressive alliance formed with Scotland's interests front and centre and the Tories locked out of government, then only a vote for the SNP can deliver that outcome. And of course, fundamentally, when it comes to a choice for Scotland between Westminster control and becoming an independent country, Labour always supports Tory government over self-government. They would inexplicably, in my view, rather see Scotland's future in Boris Johnson's hands than in the hands of the people of Scotland. Although their policy on whether to give people the right to choose their own future in a new independence referendum seems, if I can be charitable, to change with the wind, there is no doubt where they stand on the substantive question. Therefore, Westminster control every time, no matter how many Tory governments we get and no matter how much damage the Tories do to Scotland. And make no mistake, it is now crystal clear that continued Westminster control means multiple threats to Scotland, to our economy and our living standards, to our NHS and our other public services. And that is why this election is so vital. It will determine what path Scotland takes. Will these threats become reality, or will we decide differently by taking our future into our hands rather than leaving it in the hands of Boris Johnson and a broken Westminster system? Let me outline 3 of those threats and how a vote for the SNP can head them off. First of all, there is the direct economic threat of Brexit. Leaving the EU will mean lower economic growth and therefore lower tax revenues to fund our public services. By the end of the next decade, a trade deal like the one favoured by Boris Johnson could wipe £9 billion from the Scottish economy relative to EU membership. And leaving with no trade deal, which is still a distinct possibility, could see that rise to £12.7 billion. The second threat is to the workforce. The end of freedom of movement will make it harder to attract NHS and social care staff, and it will mean fewer people working in Scotland and therefore contributing tax revenue to public services. You know, at current immigration rates, our working age population is expected to remain stable over the next 25 years, whereas with reduced migration from the EU, it is projected to decline by between 3% and 5%. The UK Government's own Migration Advisory Committee concluded that EU migrants contribute more to the health service and social care than they use in services. And they accepted that the care sector would face even more serious challenges if migration from the EU was restricted. Yet that is precisely the scenario that this sector faces. In this election, the Tories are deliberately and shamefully giving the impression that our fellow EU citizens are a burden on our NHS instead of a vital support. That is a disgrace, and it really has to stop. The third threat comes from the Tory power grab on the Scottish Parliament in their pursuit of their Brexit vision, or nightmare to some of us. Remember, the Tories fought tooth and nail against devolution in the first place. Don't ever forget that. The so-called Tory detoxification strategy, designed to convince voters in Scotland that the Tories now embrace devolution, has proved to be very short-lived. They've already used Brexit to grab powers from the Scottish Parliament. They've legislated for the first time ever on devolved matters without the consent of MSPs. They've even taken the Scottish Government to court in an attempt to strike down an act of the Scottish Parliament. They're also threatening to take charge of funding in devolved areas currently controlled by the Scottish Government under the EU Structural Funds programme. You know, with the right wing of the Tory party in full cry, can anyone have any confidence that there won't be a further power grab attempt on Scotland's Parliament, as UK-wide they compromise on workers' rights and environmental standards. After all, the Tories are desperate to do a trade deal with Donald Trump. That could mean large rises in the cost of NHS drugs. President Trump has said everything, including the NHS, is on the table. In government, the Tories have made it clear they're prepared to rip up the devolution settlement if it gets in the way of Brexit. So we should be in no doubt that they would do the same if devolution got in the way of a Trump trade deal. Now, of course, SNP MPs will do everything they can to stop this from happening. The SNP will introduce an NHS protection bill to explicitly protect the health service in all 4 countries of the UK from being a bargaining chip in trade deals. But Scotland's future should not be dependent on the whims of Westminster. So a vote for the SNP is a vote to deprive Boris Johnson of the majority that would enable him to do all of this. But more fundamentally, a vote for the SNP is a vote to escape Brexit and the threats it poses to our economy and public services. And it is a vote to secure the right to choose our own future. And if the future we then choose is as an independent member of the EU, we will be able to take full advantage of the single market, currently around 8 times the size of the UK alone. If we look at Ireland, it is striking how the combination of independence and EU membership led to huge economic gains. As an independent country, Scotland would be in a unique position to act as a bridge between the rest of the UK and the EU, making us a magnet for global investment, which in turn would boost growth and tax revenue for public services. A vote for the SNP is also a vote for a migration policy tailored to our needs. We can end the hostile environment. We can retain freedom of movement. The SNP government has made it clear just how much we value those from the EU and elsewhere who contribute to our NHS and public services. With control over Scottish migration policy here in Scotland, we will have the means to ensure that we remain an attractive destination for people who want to build a life and make a contribution to our country. A vote for the SNP is also a vote to end the democratic outrage of Westminster Tory governments with no mandate in Scotland, to move on from the right-wing Tories itching to get their hands on devolution. And of course, a vote for the SNP is a vote to protect Scotland from being at the mercy of a Donald Trump trade deal. It is instead a chance to secure a future as part of the world's biggest trading bloc in which all members have to give their consent to trade deals. Compare that to the way Scotland has been ignored by Westminster. In government in Holyrood, the SNP is working hard to improve our health service, our schools and our police service. We're working with others across Scotland to improve lives. We've introduced a progressive tax system and we are determined to keep public services in public hands. But all of that progress is at risk if Boris Johnson gets the majority he is seeking. So at this election, there is no doubt that Scotland is facing a crucial question. Who should decide our future? Should it be the people who live here or the likes of Boris Johnson? With a vote for the SNP, we can deprive the Tories of the free hand that they so desperately want. We can protect the right of the people of Scotland to decide their own future. We can stand up against Brexit and the threats it poses to our public services. We can escape the Westminster chaos and an emboldened right-wing Tory government. And we can win that right to choose the future we want for this and future generations. So my message at this election is clear and at its heart it is simple. Vote SNP for a better country and to put Scotland's future into Scotland's hands. Thank you very much.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon there. We're just going to see if there's questions from the floor. I think they are. A vote for the SNP, she said, is a vote to escape the mess of Brexit. Questions now.
I'll start with Glenn Campbell.
First Minister, First Minister, if you manage to stop Brexit, will you not deny yourself the justification for an independence referendum next year?
Before I answer your question, Glenn, can I take the opportunity to embarrass somebody in the audience? I meant to do it in my speech. Jerry Moriarty is celebrating his 23rd birthday today, so happy birthday, Jerry. My apologies, Glenn, I'll come to your question now. It's not your birthday as well, is it? No. Good. No is the short answer to that. The proposition I'm putting to the people of Scotland in this election is that Brexit illustrates why we need to be in charge of our own future. As I said in my remarks, Brexit is the most extreme example of the broken nature of the Westminster system for Scotland, but it is only one example, one illustration. Even if Brexit is stopped and the UK remains, there is no guarantee that down the line we're not back there. You know, people like Nigel Farage are not simply going to pack up and go away. There is no guarantee that we don't have other policies imposed on us by a Tory government that we don't vote for. So Brexit has brought into sharp relief this fundamental question. If we want Scotland to be the country we all believe it can be, then how do we best secure that? Do we best secure that by allowing people like Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, even Jeremy Corbyn to determine Scotland's path and what kind of country we are, or do we take that future into our own hands and decide these things for ourselves? And I think increasingly people in Scotland are seeing the benefit of being in charge of our own destiny. Libby.
First Minister, during last night's television debates, Boris Johnson said that he believed that the SNP had already done a deal with Jeremy Corbyn on a second independence referendum. Jeremy Corbyn said that that was nonsense. Then this morning, Hamza Yousaf said that he believes that Labour will agree to an independence referendum in 2020. Can you clarify who is telling the truth on this, please?
Well, I was going to say it's actually possible for all these things to be true, but when Boris Johnson is in the sentence, it's probably unlikely that what he's saying... actually kind of sort of amuses, this is not directed at you, Libby, incidentally, but it kind of amuses me that given his record as Prime Minister so far, anybody is still prepared to believe a single word that comes out of Boris Johnson's mouth. Anyway, that is me going off at a bit of a tangent. There is no deal with Jeremy Corbyn. The conversations I've had with Jeremy Corbyn in recent months, the most recent of those was just before the election was called in Westminster, have been about Brexit, about how the opposition parties at Westminster were trying to come together to stop Brexit and to find a better way forward. The most recent discussion was also about how we could get the issue taken to a general election, which we are now in. But as Hamza Yousaf said, I do believe if the parliamentary arithmetic enables this, then Jeremy Corbyn is not going to turn his back on an opportunity for a UK Labour government just because he's determined to block the right of the Scottish people to choose their own future. It would take a lot of explaining from him if he was to say, no, I'm going to walk away from this opportunity. Why am I going to do that? Because I want to veto Scotland's right to self-determination. This is a man who favours self-determination for virtually every other country on the face of the planet. It would be a bit odd if he was to give up his chance at government. I'm not asking for anything unreasonable here. I'm not asking Labour or anybody to suddenly support independence. I'm not even demanding that Labour MSPs in the Scottish Parliament vote for an independence referendum. I'm simply making the point that we should not find it difficult to get Westminster politicians to accept that the question of independence, the question of whether there should be another referendum and on what timescale, are decisions for the people of Scotland through our democratically elected Parliament. And that's the proposition I'm putting forward in this election. And it is an election, so it's an opportunity for people in Scotland to send that message to Jeremy Corbyn and to Boris Johnson that our future is not up to them, our future is up to us.
Thank you, First Minister. Craig Payton from the Press Association. You said that Westminster will be engulfed by Brexit for many years to come. If Scotland does vote to become an independent country through a referendum, how long will that process take? And do you believe that the process or the matter will be put to bed after a vote to leave the United Kingdom?
I believe when we have the opportunity to choose our future again, people in Scotland will opt for independence. I know and I can understand why, particularly proponents of Brexit, want to, make the sort of draw the analogy between the Brexit process and independence. But much as I oppose Brexit, and I really oppose Brexit in principle as well as for all the practical reasons I've been talking about, there was nothing inevitable about the mess that the Brexit process became. That was down to the fact that those who advocated leave in the referendum didn't put any detail of what it would mean in practice, of the trade-offs and compromises that would be required to implement that before people. Then, after the vote, we had Theresa May come in as Prime Minister and immediately put forward a whole series of contradictory red lines that still tried to pull the wool over people's eyes and avoid telling people what the realities of the situation would be. Contrast that with the independence referendum in 2014. There was a detailed prospectus. Of course, not everybody agreed with it, and there was vigorous debate about the detail of that, but it was there for people to judge. We were very upfront, at times very controversially, about some of the compromises and trade-offs. The currency union, for example, was perhaps the foremost example of that, and we had very detailed plans in place to manage our way through a transition. There was a whole floor in St Andrew's House with a transition team ready to go. That was one of the more heartbreaking moments of the day after the referendum, was standing that down. But we had done the planning, and we will do so again. And let us not allow the charlatans who were dishonest with people over Brexit to somehow suggest that constitutional change has to be that way. It was that way and is that way with Brexit because of their dishonesty and their lack of planning. And these are mistakes the independence campaign didn't make in 2014 and will not make in future.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon, they're continuing to take questions from the audience, stressing that, as she has said before, that the future of Scotland should be in the hands of Scottish voters, not necessarily defined by Westminster. Also talking about all the things the SNP has done for Scotland, including investments in the police and the NHS, in comparison, she says, to Westminster politics.
You heard Nicola Sturgeon reference it there. Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn went head-to-head last night in the